So the fact that many of the New Testament documents were written decades later, upwards of up to 90 AD with John's Book of Revelation, does that decrease the credibility of the word for word understanding of it? Like, can we, except for our faith that it was inspired by the Holy Spirit, can we say with any evidence that it is true word for word because it was written decades later?
First of all, not all of it was written decades later. There are some people who are saying that the Gospel of Mark may have been written even in the late 30s, certainly the 40s. The Gospel, Galatians was probably written about 49 AD. But the important point here is not when the documents were written down, but what sources went into what the writers wrote down. And Dr. 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗏, who is the top scholar in the world on the resurrection, he's been teaching at Liberty University for years. He got his PhD at Michigan State, went through about a 10-year period of doubt himself, but is finishing his magnum opus right now on the resurrection. It's over 5,000 pages long. And Dr. 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗏 has found at least 41 creeds in the New Testament that predate when the documents were written down. For example, one of the most famous ones, and it's probably the earliest evidence for the resurrection in the entire Bible, is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-8, where Paul says, I received what I'm now passing on to you. And he talks about that Christ died, was buried, rose again, and whom he appeared to. That creed was something that even skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman up at Chapel Hill here admits is extremely early. In fact, some say it's within months of the alleged resurrection. These creeds were easy to remember because many of the people were illiterate. So they put it in a rhythmic form so people could remember it. Those creeds were later written down, and in 1 Corinthians was written down probably in about 55 AD, but it had circulated since about 33 AD, and it was known as a creed, and everybody knew it. Paul just put it in the letter he wrote to the Corinthians. So the sources are more important than the dates of when the document was written. How about a modern-day example? If I right now wanted to write, say, a book about the Vietnam War, and I went and interviewed a lot of Vietnam War veterans, and they gave me their eyewitness testimony, what's more important, their eyewitness testimony or when I wrote it down?
Their eyewitness testimony.
Exactly.
So they're remembering from years later.
What's that?
They're remembering years later, so their word-for-word memory may not be as accurate as it would be the day after they experienced something.
It depends. There is something known as an impact event. An impact event is something you will never forget. In fact, only some of you will be able to answer this question, maybe just a few. But how many in this room can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963? Hold your hand up. You see these people, ladies and gentlemen, with their hands up? These people are very old. Okay? I was 2 years old in 2 days. I'm a toddler. I'm standing in the living room at our home in 𝗏𝗏, New Jersey, and my mother is sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV, weeping uncontrollably. They killed the president. They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. I can still see my mother in my mind right now when she was 26 years old, sitting on that ottoman crying. She's 85 now. But I can see her when she was 26 because it was an impact event. I'll never forget it. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? Some of you can remember that. Why can you remember that? Because it was an impact event. Now, 9/11 was what, 22 years ago? And most of you who are old enough can remember something important about that day. But if I ask you where you were 22 days ago, most of you are going to go, I don't know, let me look at my iPhone. What was I doing then? See? So when dramatic events occur, like a resurrection, do you think those people would have remembered it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, they would have remembered everything about it because it was such an impact event. Also, when Jesus did a sermon, do you think he did it just once? Do you think I've done this presentation just once?
No, I've listened to several.
Clint over here, he could do this. If I get sick, he could come up here and do it. because he's heard it so many times. He does not, you don't have to write it down, right? When you hear something over and over again, you're going to remember it. This is why when people like Bart Ehrman, he'll give an illustration like, would you remember what George Bush said at the 2005 State of the Union address? Of course I don't. But I remember what George Bush said 10 days after 9/11 when he stood up with the badge of that firefighter or that police officer that was killed in the World Trade Tower. I remember that because it was an impact event. And if you either have an impact event or you hear something over and over and over again, you're not going to forget it. And what if it's both? Get an impact event and you hear it over and over again? Yeah, we know what they said. We know what happened. We know what they did, regardless of when they wrote it down. Because it was written down during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses.